It's time for Success in Real Estate with Frankie Griffin, owner and broker in charge of the Palmetto Success Team, certified residential specialist, accredited buyer representative, military relocation professional, real estate appraiser, and author of Success in Real Estate. If you are interested in buying or selling a home, investing in real estate, or having your home appraised, you will enjoy Success in Real Estate. Now, here's Frankie Griffin.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Success in Real Estate. I'm Frankie Griffin. Friday morning, again, getting ready for the weekend. Going to be a beautiful weekend. Gamecocks are going to put a hurting on some Commodores. There's no question in my mind. I think it's going to be a blowout. I honestly do. But I bring that up, as we always do on football weekend, because we like to try to give away some free real estate classes at our Real Estate School for Success, certainly when we have football in the air. And as we do every Carolina football game, if you go on our Facebook page, again, the Real Estate School for Success Facebook page, you'll see where I have earlier this morning, I put a post about if you want to go on and guess the score of the Carolina-Vandy game tomorrow. If you guess the exact score and winner, you get a free real estate class of any kind. And if no one guesses the exact score, then somebody's going to win. Whoever is closest to the exact score and guess the right winner, then you're going to get at least a 50% discount off a real estate class. So I think that's going to be fun. I love just to watch and see what the scores are. I got to tell you, I really think Carolina is they're out to make a point this weekend. And I do believe they're going to make it, and I would hate to be Vandy this weekend, but it is what it is. So just go on our Facebook page, Real Estate School for Success. And if you haven't liked us yet, please do. We'd love for you to come back and guess the score again next week. It's always fun, just something fun to do. Well, here's what I wanted to sort of discuss or talk about this morning. And, this is a question I get all the time. All the time. And it's not just home buyers and sellers. It's real estate agents, brokers, needing clarification or specific questions about property disclosure requirements when selling a house, at least in South Carolina. And so I just thought we'd spend some time and go over some of these things, because I get so many questions. And just this past week, it just seemed like every day, it was calls and emails about property disclosures. So let's go ahead and talk about that. And if you have any questions or comments or things about disclosure requirements maybe you don't understand or want clarification on, love to hear from you. You can give us a call here in studio. The number is 803-799-8255. Again, 799-8255. And we'll do the best we can to help you out. Okay, well, to start out with, there is a law in South Carolina. It's called the South Carolina Property Condition Disclosure Law, which requires anyone selling a residential property. And by the way, a residential property defined by this law would be obviously a single-family property right up to 4 dwelling units, so a quadruplex. So a quadruplex, triplex, duplex, and obviously single-family dwellings all fall under this residential disclosure law. There is a state-approved form that has to be filled out, and has to be filled out by the seller. And we're actually going to talk a little bit about that here in just a moment. But the point I wanted to make is you can't just go writing stuff up, come up with your own form, type some things that you might know about the property, and then just use that as your disclosure. That does not meet the legal requirement. You have to use the state-approved form. And the reason I bring that up, because I see a lot of for sale by owners using just made up forms, or they'll just type some things up about the property and then provide it to the buyer. I'm assuming because they have knowledge, or at least they're aware of the fact they have to disclose certain things, but maybe they're not aware of the fact it has to be on a specific state approved form. And if it's not on this form and it's not signed by the buyer and the seller, then this disclosure requirement has not been met. So just go ahead and throw that out. It's got to be on the state-approved form. And if anybody needs a copy of the form, a blank copy, maybe you want to sell by owner and would like a free copy. Well, it would be free, but if you just want a blank copy of the form, you don't know where else to get it, I'll be more than happy to email you a blank copy. All you got to do is call me, email me, anything I can do to help. That's what we're here to do. Now, not only do we have to fill the form out, the law actually states that this form has to be provided to the buyer and then obviously signed by the buyer, and then both parties have a copy of the executed document before you enter into the contract of sale. So basically, the main thing I want to make sure real estate agents get there. You know, if I receive an offer from an agent representing their buyer, then one of the things that I would expect to also be attached to the offer would be the property disclosure statement. Because the way this law reads, even if you make me an offer, and I say me, my seller, and my seller likes the offer, might want to accept the offer, but the way the law reads, we cannot accept your offer until we get a copy of the property disclosure statement back. And I see that as an issue an awful lot. I'll get the offer, then I have to contact the agent back and ask them, have you seen the property disclosure? And most times they say, yes, we have. And then I say, well, then I need to get a copy of that. Please send that to me. And then we can actually entertain your offer. Because that's the first thing. We got to have an executed copy of this document before we can enter into the contract of sale. There's a reason the law requires that, and we're going to actually get into that. I think we got probably a minute or so left in this segment, but in the next segment, I want to talk about what happens if we do enter into a contract of sale, and for some reason the buyer either never received a copy of the disclosure, and it might be because the seller never provided it. Any number of reasons. But anyway, we never got it completed, and now the house is under contract. Well, now what do you do? Can you get out of the contract? I think you're going to have a very difficult time doing that. But anyway, we're going to discuss all of this on the next side. Love to hear from you if you have any questions. 799-8255. Maybe once or twice I've seen buyers write something like that into the contract, but we're going to stick with what's most common, what we tend to see most of the time. But here's the reason the law says everybody has to get a copy. It has to be fully executed, and everybody understand the issues, if any, with the property, because if this document is not provided, and assuming you're already under contract, sellers accepted the offer, the law actually identifies 3 specific things that it says will not take place or will not happen if the property disclosure is not completed. And the first thing it says that will not happen is the contract will not be voided. So buyer and seller, once you enter into that contract, you're under contract. And the fact that you didn't get or never completed the property disclosure is not going to be a legal way to get out of the contract. So in essence, you stuck with the contract the way it is. Number 2, it says it will not create a defect in title. So that's good. But then the third thing it specifically states that if it's not completed, that the lack of the property disclosure statement is not a valid reason to have a closing even delayed, much less put off. So you can't try to hold up closing or delay closing waiting to get this property disclosure. So got to get it before you enter into the contract, because once you enter that contract, you're buying it. It's or at least you're not getting out of the contract for because you never received a copy of the disclosure. Okay, I'll get it out here in a second. Now, but here's something else I wanted to make sure that everybody's aware of, because a lot of people, I think, miss this part. But in the law, it does state seller has to fill the form out. Seller, you have to fill this form out yourself. Now, at least if I'm the listing agent, you've hired me to help you sell your house. I'm not going to fill the form out for you, but I do like to go through the form just to make sure you understand exactly what you're filling out, what the questions are, and that sort of thing. And we're actually going to take a look at that here in just a second. But what I'm also hearing is this: a lot of real estate agents are actually filling this form out on behalf of the seller. I can only assume maybe the agent reads the question, the seller tells them the answer, and then the agent just goes and fills out the answer according to what the seller said. Well, something to be aware of here, agent. The law states that whoever fills the form out is now considered the signatory to this document. Now, if I translate that, basically what that means is this: whoever fills that form out is now liable or potentially liable for everything in the form and not in it. So if something was not disclosed and not made part of this disclosure, and the agent filled the form out, agent, you've taken on that potential liability for failure to disclose whatever that issue was. So that's an awful lot of liability for a real estate agent to go ahead and fill this out, when the law is very clear and says seller must fill it out themselves. But here's something else that's kind of interesting, because I always ask this question to a lot of agents, especially when I'm teaching class. But I'll ask the question: who is responsible to make sure this document gets into the hands of the buyer? And again, if you read in the law, it states seller is responsible to make sure the buyer gets a copy of this document. So seller has to fill it out, and the seller's responsible to get it to the buyer. So then obviously that kind of lends a question here. Then what is the agent's responsibility under this property disclosure law? And it's actually pretty simple. The agent's responsibility is to make sure their client knows what they're legally responsible for. That's it. That's it. Now, with all that said, I do not recommend real estate agents be filling out these documents. I would go with what the law says. But I did want to talk about getting it to the buyer. Look, there's nothing wrong with helping there's nothing wrong with the agent trying to assist the seller in getting it to the buyer. There's no issues with that. It's just at the end of the day, if it's not provided or the buyer doesn't get it, seller, according to this law, you're responsible for that. But as agents, we do tend to help get it to the buyer. We can make copies of it, maybe leave a stack of them in the house that buyers, as they're walking through, can pick one up. But I think most often where we get it, we can load it onto the MLS. There's a documents link there. And for every house on the MLS, you can click documents and you'll see all the associated documents with that property. And hopefully one of those documents will be the property disclosure. Then that way the buyer's agent that's maybe getting ready to show the house to a potential buyer, they can go on that link, print out the form, and then they've got a copy of it. Actually, when they go look at the house, makes things a whole lot easier for sure. So anyway, I think as long as everybody gets a copy of it, make sure we understand what our requirements are, then you should not have any problems at all. That's what the agent's responsibility is. Now, here's one of the big questions. In fact, I got an email this week from an agent that apparently the agent informed the seller they have to fill out the property disclosure statement, and the seller just told the agent point blank, I'm not doing it. It's ridiculous. It creates additional liability for me as the seller, and I don't like it. Therefore, I'm not going to do it. So the question this agent had is, if the seller refuses to provide it, can I, as the agent, go ahead and still list the property and sell it? And the answer to the question is absolutely. Again, the agent's only responsibility under this law is to make sure your client knows what their legal responsibilities are. So if you've disclosed or you told the seller this is something you're required by law to do, it's not an option, you have to do it, and they refuse to do it, then you've done your job. Now, I would suggest if you're going to list the property, I would at least have that seller sign something acknowledging that you told them they have to provide it, and they chose not to do it. I would at least get that before I list it. Now, with that said, your seller just told you they don't care what the law says. Do you really see this deal getting any better for you? I'm thinking not. I certainly don't think it would be a good idea to engage in that transaction. Anytime you have a client, whether it be the buyer or the seller, just point blank tell you, I don't care what the law says. This is what I want. This is how I'm going to do it. All you can do is try to help, and if they don't want the help, then I suggest you just pack your little bag and go on to the next one. But to answer your question, you're more than welcome to help them, or go ahead and list the house if that's what you choose to do. All right, now, here's where we see some other issues here. When the seller fills the form out, and it's usually at the time we're getting ready to put the house on the market, here's where we run into problems. And this is something you really, especially if you're that listing agent, you really need to make sure the seller understands this. Put the house on the market, and we've got an offer. In fact, it's a really good offer, so seller decides to accept it. We've got the property disclosure signed. Each party's got a copy of it. But in the first 10 days of that of that house going under contract, obviously now the buyer's going to be seeking to do their home inspections, termite inspections, heating and air. You name it. They're doing all their inspections. Got to do their due diligence. And then let's say we find, or the home inspector finds a few problems or issues with the house, and the buyer doesn't like it and can't live with it. So obviously now the buyer has the right to submit a repair addendum to the seller. And seller, you now have to choose, are you willing to make these repairs or fix it, replace it, whatever is needed under this addendum. But, if the seller says no, seller, you better understand what's getting ready to happen. I know we're out of time in this segment, but on the other side, we're certainly going to talk about the issues if the seller says no. Give me a call, 799-8255. All right, good morning again. Welcome back to Success in Real Estate. I'm Frankie Griffin, real estate broker and appraiser, and we're talking about property disclosures and the issues you tend to run into, because I get so many emails, questions, especially from real estate agents, about the various aspects of these laws, what the actual requirements are, and so forth. But speaking of liability and all the laws, we've got everybody's favorite attorney on the line, Mr. Andy On with On and McKay Law Firm.
Hey, Frankie, how you doing, buddy?
Oh, you know this is a fine date.
Well, I apologize for the beach music in the background, but I am in I'm in Greenville at the Greater Greenville Association of Realtors, and we're actually talking today about home inspections.
Yeah.
But we had a seminar yesterday on property liability, property disclosure liability, and we'll be talking about a little bit of that today. One of the things that continues to plague us in property disclosure liability, Frankie, in my opinion, is some of the documentation MLS puts out in the Columbia area. We've talked about on the MLS sheet versus the input sheet, there are three different sets of representations, and they're not necessarily consistent. And one of the things we talked about yesterday is how to merge those representations in such a way that the owner, the seller of the property, has to essentially sign off on all those representations, because otherwise it leaves the real estate professional exposed on those issues. So, we talked about that. Talked about a lot of other great subjects, and it was a wonderful presentation. But I wanted to call in and say hello and tell you that we wish everybody a great weekend from here in Greenville. So.
Absolutely, that's awesome. Train them up.
All right, buddy. You take care.
Thank you, Andy. Have a good one.
Bye.
As Andy On, Andy On with On and McKay Law Firm. He does so much, not only for our community, but as you just heard, he's in Greenville, and he helps try to educate and train and help agents and buyers and sellers try to stay out of trouble, and that's what he does. He does such a good job, and we appreciate what he does. But in the previous segment, before we went to break, we were talking about what happens when the seller receives a repair addendum as a result of the home inspection or some other inspection that the buyer had completed. What are the seller's options here? Obviously, they could choose to fix everything or replace everything, whatever needed to be done, or they could choose, I'm not doing any of this stuff. Or they could say, I'll do this and this, but I'm not doing these other things. Okay, so there's some options there for the seller. But here's something you need to understand if you're the seller. If you refuse to do anything the buyer asks for, the buyer has the right, not saying they will, but they have the right to terminate the contract and walk away, and without penalty. Seller, here's where the issue you might have if they walk away. You now have a complete copy of that home inspection, because when they send you that repair addendum, they have to attach a copy of all the inspections that they're referencing in that addendum. So you now have a copy of this inspection. It could be 10, 15, 20 pages or more long. Point is, you now have knowledge of a whole lot of potential problems with the house that you may not have known about when you initially filled out this property disclosure. But now you do have knowledge of all these things, and because you're looking at the inspection. According to the law, you now have to go back and correct that property disclosure statement. So all these little things that we now know is a potential defect, you have to disclose that. So if it's not going to be fixed, repaired, replaced, or whatever, then you have to disclose what the issues were. And the problem you could potentially run into here, once you disclose all these issues or what the home inspector found, you could potentially have a problem trying to find another buyer that would be willing to offer you, maybe they might not offer you anywhere near what you just let walk away because you refused to make certain repairs. So again, now I'm not trying to say you need to go ahead and make everything or make all the repairs that a buyer asks for. I'm not trying to suggest that, but I do think it's important to understand if the buyer walks away, what the potential issues could be. All right, so we got a caller on the line, and I think we got Ryan. How you doing this morning, Ryan?
Good morning, Frankie. How are you?
Oh, you know this is a fine day today.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Hey, enjoying the show. Something that you said kind of caught my curiosity about if the seller refuses to make a repair or grant what the buyer is asking for. I do some work for some property investors who are buying a lot of houses, paying cash, basically kind of a as-is type thing. Typically, a lot of these properties need a fair amount of work. And I'm curious, is there something written, is there a different contract written for those type of transactions where the seller doesn't have to let the buyer walk away, where once they've made an offer as is, I mean, to me, I would think there's no room to come back and say, well, I didn't know there was termite damage, or I didn't know there was, roof leaks. Yeah. Now I want you to either fix them or I walk away.
Well, it depends on how the offer is written up. In the contract we use here around the Midlands, there's two options that the buyer and seller could agree to when it comes to the as-is I'm talking about. But there's a provision in the contract, in fact, it's paragraph 10 in the contract, that gives them the right to agree to buy the property as is, but with a due diligence period. In other words, buyer still wants to have inspections to know the condition, but regardless of what they find on the inspection, they're not going to come back and ask for repairs. But under that provision, the buyer has the right, if they're not comfortable with something they find in that inspection, they can terminate and walk away. The other part, which is 10B, if they decide to go with that option, then that means they're buying the house as is with no due diligence period. So now they're buying it as is, whatever's there. So it depends on what they go with.
I got you. Okay, well, that's interesting. It's kind of a whole different world, seeing people buying these houses and very rarely even doing any type of inspections. I mean, we certainly walk through and estimate the cost to paint it and do the repairs needed, and in some cases they know that there's substantial, either damage to the foundation or, the roof and HVAC and everything else. I mean, I've seen some properties purchased that needed upwards of $100,000 of repairs.
Sure.
But,
yeah.
Haven't seen one where they walked away from it. I think they get it such a good deal that they say, well, whatever needs to be done, we've got the money in the margin to do it.
Well, as long as you got the money and you could still walk away with some equity, that's what investors, I think, are looking for. So,
absolutely.
So they can do it. Well, that's a good question. I appreciate that, Ryan.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Frankie. Take care.
You
good
too.
Weekend.
You too. All right. Well, it was a good question. Obviously, there are some options within the contract of sale that buyer and seller can agree to. There's no question. But going back to what I was saying a moment ago, seller, you just need to understand what your decision could, or how that could impact the deal, and not only this deal, but the next deals. Because I'm telling you, once you say no and that buyer walks away, you now likely have a full inspection full of stuff, issues, problems that the inspector wrote up. You now have knowledge of it, and now you have to redisclose. And if you don't redisclose, that could come back and bite you. You could have a lot of liability there, because the reality is you now have knowledge of these issues that you did not know about when the house went on the market. So that's something to really be careful of, and just understand what's going to happen, or what could happen if you say no. Now, I know we're probably under a minute before we have to take our next break, but what I want to talk about on the other side, how can we protect you from those situations and things you might find out in the home inspection? We'll talk about that when we come back. 799-8255.
Local talk radio experience. The Point.
Now at 100.7 FM and 1470 AM.
All right, good morning again. Welcome back to Success in Real Estate. I'm Frankie Griffin, real estate broker and appraiser. We're talking about property disclosures. And this is our last segment. So if you have any questions or comments or just anything real estate related I could help you with, give us a call. The number is 799-8255. Again, 799-8255. Here's what I like to do when I list properties for sale. So if you call me, you want to sell your house, and you allow me to do it, I'd love that. And by the way, if you want my information or trying to get in touch with me, just go to my website, which is frankiegriffin.com. Again, frankiegriffin.com. Obviously, you'll see all my information there, cell phone, email, you name it. It's all right there, and we'd love to help you any way we can. A lot of really good information on our website, by the way, so please check it out. But here's what I like to do. One of the things I will do before we even put the house on the market is I will have a home inspection done for ourselves. So it's a pre-home inspection. And by the way, I pay for that, and I do not charge it back in commission or anything. I pay for that myself because I think it's that important, not only for liability purposes, but I think you'll find, seller, and I wish I had time to get into some more details than what I'm going to have in this final segment, but we can certainly sit down and talk about it. But here's how this is going to help you real quick. One, we identify what all these little issues are. And one of the things I find most of the time, the things written up by a home inspector are what I would just consider or classify as cosmetic. You're going to have issues. I mean, if you have a house that's 20 years old, 40 years old, whatever, and you live there, you're going to have some wear and tear. I mean, that's part of the deal. But that's not going to keep home inspectors from writing up every little thing they find. Well, most of the things they tend to write up are things, seller, we could fix ourselves. Don't even need a contractor. It's just very simple, uncomplicated things that we could fix or correct ourselves. So let's do that. We go ahead and make those repairs, and then we don't have those issues. And you'll find also, I'm telling you, this is one of the ways that a lot of buyers, because of the way their agent might be representing them, but this is a way to try to get you to actually come off the price, or actually lower the price that you've already agreed to sell it for. A lot of this to me is very irritating, and quite frankly, to me, I consider it highly unethical practice. But when buyers start using that home inspection as a way to try to force the seller to put the house back in new condition, but at the price they've agreed to sell it, that's just wrong. That is absolutely wrong. Shouldn't be doing that. So for that reason, now that we have this pre-inspection, we go and fix my guess is we'll wind up likely fixing everything on it. But now we can disclose that to the buyer. Buyer, here's what our inspector found. And all these things have been repaired. Or if there's things on there that we decide not to repair, obviously, seller, that would be your call. But we disclose we disclose that up front too, and here's why that's important. Because I'll make sure the buyer's agent knows. Here's the condition we know the house is in. There might be one or two things here that have not been repaired, but buyer, you have knowledge of it as well right now. Before you make your offer, you know this exists. So what I will inform the buyer's agent of, if there's anything here that we did not repair that the buyer would insist on being repaired, then that needs to be addressed in your offer. You need to write that offer when you make it, and then the seller can now say, well, okay, well, we'll do that, but here's what the sales price is going to do or be if we do this or if we do that. So we're going to price the house based on what you're asking the seller to do, or in some cases not do. But once we put it on the market, it's priced in the current condition we all know it's in. I have found that tends to help the seller an awful lot by doing stuff like this. There's a number of other things I'd love to be able to talk about. I'm just not going to have time to get into all that stuff. But look, if you're thinking about selling your house, give us a call. We'd love to help you with that. I've got a lot of things that we like to do that I don't think very many agents at all do that set the seller up for success. That's what we're trying to do. It's just very irritating to me how some of these buyers and their agents will make an offer knowing certain things are going to need to be done, but they do not address it in the offer. Rather, they will just try to negotiate the lowest price we can get and then use the home inspection as the tool to force the seller to go back and make all these repairs, fix all these things, make it new, but at the price they agreed to sell it. And to me, that's just wrong. Not doing that no more. Tired of that. Okay. In the time we got left, what I did want to hit on was this. Going back to this property disclosure piece, there are some sellers that are exempt by law. When I say exempt, I mean they do not have to provide a property disclosure. Now, in the law, it identifies 15 exemptions. But if you were to look at them, you'd notice the last two, 14 and 15, are both dealing with timeshares, which is not what we're dealing with. So, in essence, there's 13 exemptions from potential exemptions for sellers that are trying to sell their home. I did want to touch on one real quick that I hear claimed as an exemption a lot, all the time, and it's just not. It's not true. And I really hope if there are any real estate agents out there telling this to their seller clients, we need to get this straight. But investors are not exempt. I'm just telling you right now, you can look at all these exemptions and not one of them identifies investors. Because that's what I tend to see an awful lot. You see a house for sale, I look on the documents link to get the property disclosure, and there's not one there. So I call the listing agent and say, hey, look, do you have a property disclosure? I got a buyer that might be interested. And they tell me, well, the seller's exempt, so we don't have it. And if you're exempt, fine. But I am entitled to know what the exemption is. And I'm telling you, so often they tell me the exemption is, well, it's an investor. And because they're an investor, obviously they've never lived there. So there's no way they could have any actual knowledge of what may or may not be wrong with the house. Regardless of how good that might sound, it is not an exemption. And I'm telling you, investors, if you don't fill out these property disclosures, you could potentially be looking at a fair amount of liability here, depending on what kind of issues actually may exist that you did not disclose. So investors have to fill it out. And the reason they say investors are not exempt, really for two reasons. One, a lot of times they'll say, well, it was a rental property. A tenant's always been there. I've never actually lived there myself. Well, two reasons why you're not exempt, seller. One, you had ample opportunity to inspect the property yourself when you purchased it, so you should have some idea of what the condition is. Number two, if there were tenants living there, I think it's safe to assume if there are problems with that house, that tenant will let you know about it. So there's a good chance you're going to have some knowledge of what issues may exist with that property. So investors are absolutely not exempt at all. one real quick that one of the exemptions I did want to hit from the on, which I think is important. If the buyer and seller agree in writing, it is not required, then seller, you're exempt and will not have to provide the disclosure statement. But again, seller, you better have something in writing from the buyer where they've acknowledged that they are exempting you. They do not require the property disclosure, and then it's not required. So that's the problem. That's the one big exemption. If you just don't want to provide it, seller, then you need to get the buyer to agree to that. That way, that sort of removes a lot of that liability from you. Okay. I know we're about out of time. Well, I'd love to help you if we can. Please give me a call. Again, go to my website. Check it out. A lot of good stuff there. It's just frankiegriffin.com. frankiegriffin.com. My phone number, my email is right there. And maybe you're looking to buy a house and you're trying to search for properties for sale. You've got to check out my search. You can search the MLS right there on my website by description or map. We're out of time. Have a great weekend. You've been listening to Success in Real Estate on the Point.